Venezuela has just made a decision that is shaking the entire global lithium market and redefining the balance of power in the energy transition. On December 20th, 2025, President Nicolás Maduro signed Executive Order 4311, formally nationalizing all lithium extraction, processing, and export operations within Venezuelan territory. This means every private mining contract, every foreign partnership, and every Western-backed lithium project in Venezuela now belongs to the state. What's happening behind this decision goes far beyond resource nationalism. This move eliminates $15 billion in projected Western investments and hands China direct access to one of the world's largest untapped lithium reserves. For the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and Washington policymakers, this represents the collapse of a decade-long strategy to maintain control over the commodities that will define the 21st century economy. But here's what makes this situation explosive. An internal IMF memo leaked just 48 hours after the announcement revealed something the mainstream media has completely ignored. The fund had been secretly negotiating with Venezuelan opposition leaders to privatize the nation's lithium sector in exchange for debt restructuring and sanctions relief. Venezuela's nationalization just destroyed that plan. What you're about to hear is the hidden economic war behind this decision, the real reason Western institutions are panicking, and why this single move could trigger a domino effect across Latin America. But first, we need to understand how we got here. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to 1999, when Venezuela held the world's largest proven oil reserves, but depended entirely on Western technology and markets to extract and sell that oil. For decades, American and European oil companies operated freely in Venezuela through joint ventures and service contracts. They controlled pricing, refining, and distribution networks. The Venezuelan state collected royalties, but the real profits flowed to Houston, London, and Amsterdam. This was the system. It worked for multinational corporations and for a Venezuelan elite connected to those corporations. It did not work for the majority of Venezuelans, who saw almost none of that oil wealth reach their communities. Then Hugo Chavez came to power and began nationalizing the oil industry in stages between 2001 and 2007. The West responded with economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and eventually sanctions. By 2017, the Trump administration had imposed the harshest sanctions in the Western Hemisphere, effectively cutting Venezuela off from international financial systems. These sanctions targeted the state oil company, banned Venezuelan debt trading, and froze billions in overseas assets. The official justification was human rights and democracy promotion. The real objective was regime change and the restoration of a government that would reopen the energy sector to foreign investment on terms favorable to Washington. For decades, this system seemed unshakable. The United States controlled the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Development Bank, and regional security architecture through military partnerships and training programs. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank provided loans with conditions that required privatization, austerity, and openness to foreign capital. Any government that resisted faced isolation, sanctions, or worse. This was the framework that governed Latin America for half a century. But something changed. China became the world's largest trading partner for South America. Russia reemerged as a global power willing to challenge Western hegemony. And critically, the energy transition created a new commodity battleground. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements became more strategically important than oil. Whoever controls these materials controls the future of transportation, energy storage, and industrial production. Venezuela sits on estimated lithium reserves of 21 million metric tons, the third largest deposit in the world after Bolivia and Argentina. These reserves are located primarily in the southern states of Bolivar and Amazonas, regions rich in biodiversity but historically underdeveloped. Western geological surveys conducted between 2010 and 2015 confirmed the scale of these deposits, but Venezuela lacked the capital and technology to develop them under sanctions. That's where the IMF plan came in. According to the leaked internal memo dated November 5th, 2025, the IMF had been working with Venezuelan opposition figures since 2022 to structure a post-Maduro privatization framework. The document, circulated among senior fund economists and obtained by independent journalists, outlines a three-phase strategy. Phase one involved promising sanctions relief and debt restructuring in exchange for commitments to privatize key sectors, including lithium mining. Phase two required the establishment of legal guarantees for foreign investors, including international arbitration clauses that would allow corporations to sue Venezuela if future governments changed the terms. Phase three entailed the actual transfer of mining rights to a consortium of North American, European, and allied companies. The memo specifically names Albemarle Corporation, Livent, and Rio Tinto as preferred partners. It also references coordination with the United States Treasury Department and the National Security Council. This wasn't just economic policy, this was a geopolitical operation designed to ensure that Venezuela's lithium wealth would be controlled by Western capital and denied to China. The timeline anticipated a transition government by mid-2026 and full privatization by 2028. Venezuela's nationalization just shattered that timeline. On December 20th, President Maduro appeared on national television, flanked by Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez and newly appointed Energy and Mines Minister Delcy Rodriguez. He announced the creation of the Venezuelan National Lithium Corporation, a state entity with exclusive rights to explore, extract, process, and commercialize all lithium resources within the country. The executive order cancels existing exploration licenses held by foreign firms and voids preliminary agreements signed during previous administrations. Maduro stated clearly that Venezuela's natural resources belong to the Venezuelan people and will not be bargained away to satisfy foreign creditors or geopolitical agendas. The announcement included specific details. The government will invest $2.3 billion over the next 5 years to build domestic lithium processing capacity. Venezuela has signed technical cooperation agreements with Chinese state enterprises, including CATL and Ganfeng Lithium, to provide expertise in extraction and battery-grade processing. Russia's Rosatom will assist in developing the infrastructure for lithium hydroxide production. Bolivia's state lithium company, YLB, will share expertise from its own nationalized lithium sector. Most importantly, Venezuela committed to exporting lithium exclusively to countries that respect its sovereignty and do not participate in the sanctions regime. That means China, Russia, Iran, and other non-aligned states become the primary customers. The United States and European Union are effectively locked out. Within 72 hours, Washington responded. The State Department issued a statement condemning the nationalization as a violation of international investment norms and a threat to the rules-based economic order. The Treasury Department announced it was reviewing additional sanctions targeting Venezuelan officials involved in the lithium sector. The European Union expressed concern and called for dialogue, but notably, there was no coordinated international response. Brazil issued a neutral statement. Mexico remained silent. Colombia, despite its traditionally pro-Western stance, acknowledged Venezuela's sovereign right to manage its resources. This muted response reveals something critical. Latin American governments, even those aligned with Washington, are increasingly unwilling to automatically endorse U.S. positions on resource sovereignty. They see their own lithium, copper, and rare earth reserves and recognize that supporting Venezuela's nationalization protects their own future options. The geopolitical landscape has shifted. The automatic solidarity that the United States could once count on no longer exists. What traditional media is not reporting is the behind-the-scenes coordination that made this nationalization possible. Venezuela did not act alone or impulsively. This decision was planned over 18 months in close consultation with Beijing, Moscow, and other members of the BRICS framework. In July 2024, Venezuelan officials attended a closed-door summit in Kazan, Russia, where resource-rich developing nations discussed strategies for resisting IMF-imposed privatization. The discussions focused on legal frameworks for nationalization that minimize retaliation risks, alternative financing mechanisms that bypass Western institutions, and mutual defense pacts in case of economic or military pressure. Venezuela learned from Bolivia's successful lithium nationalization in 2023 and from Mexico's gradual reassertion of state control over its energy sector. The timing of Venezuela's announcement is not coincidental. It came just weeks after BRICS expansion added 6 new members, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It followed China's announcement of a $500 billion infrastructure fund for global South development projects, and it occurred as the IMF faces a legitimacy crisis with developing nations increasingly rejecting its policy prescriptions. Venezuela calculated that the geopolitical moment was right. Western distraction with conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, combined with China's economic leverage and the growing multipolarity of the international system, created a window of opportunity. Maduro took it, but there's something more important that connects all of this. Lithium is not just another commodity. It is the enabler of the energy transition that every major economy has committed to pursuing. Electric vehicles require lithium-ion batteries. Grid-scale energy storage for renewable power depends on lithium technology. Consumer electronics, medical devices, and advanced manufacturing all rely on lithium compounds. Current global lithium production is approximately 600,000 metric tons per year. Projected demand by 2035 exceeds 3 million metric tons annually. That gap represents the single largest supply-demand imbalance in the global commodities market. Whoever controls lithium production controls the pace and terms of the energy transition. Western nations, particularly the United States and European Union, have built their climate strategies around the assumption that they will maintain access to lithium supplies through market mechanisms and geopolitical influence. They assume that countries like Venezuela, desperate for investment and sanctions relief, would eventually capitulate and accept privatization on Western terms. Venezuela's nationalization breaks that assumption. It demonstrates that resource-rich nations can reject Western financing, partner with non-Western powers, and still develop their industries. This is the nightmare scenario for the IMF and World Bank. If Venezuela succeeds, other countries will follow. The economic implications are staggering. Western lithium companies had projected that Latin America would supply 40% of global lithium by 2040 under private sector development models. Those projections assumed access to Venezuelan, Argentinian, Chilean, and Bolivian reserves through joint ventures and licensing agreements. If all 4 countries nationalize or heavily regulate their lithium sectors, which is now increasingly likely, Western companies lose access to the largest concentration of lithium on Earth. The price implications are immediate. Lithium carbonate prices, which had fallen to $13,000 per metric ton in early 2025, jumped to $19,000 within a week of Venezuela's announcement. Industry analysts predict prices could reach $30,000 per ton if other nations follow Venezuela's example. That means electric vehicles become more expensive, grid storage projects face cost overruns. The entire energy transition timeline extends by years, possibly decades. For Western governments that have committed to phasing out internal combustion engines and achieving net zero emissions, this is a strategic disaster. They cannot meet their climate commitments without lithium, and they are losing control over lithium supply chains. China, by contrast, is securing its position. Chinese companies already control 70% of global lithium processing capacity. They have locked in supply agreements with Australia, Chile, and now Venezuela. They have invested in lithium mining operations in Africa. They have developed alternative battery technologies that reduce lithium dependence. China's strategic planning operates on 20 to 30-year horizons. While Western nations focused on sanctions and regime change in Venezuela, China built relationships, offered financing without political conditions, and positioned itself as the indispensable partner for resource development. Venezuela's nationalization, supported by Chinese technical expertise and financing, is the payoff for that long-term strategy. Beijing now has preferential access to 21 million metric tons of lithium, enough to supply its domestic battery industry for decades and dominate global electric vehicle exports. This is not just about economics. This is about who will lead the 21st century economy. The leaked IMF memo reveals the panic within Western institutions. One passage states explicitly that Venezuela's lithium nationalization, if successful, could inspire similar moves in the Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt, in Indonesia for nickel, and in Chile for copper. The memo describes this as a worst-case scenario that would fracture global supply chains and create a two-tier system where Western manufacturers pay premium prices for commodities while Chinese firms access them state-negotiated rates. The fund's proposed response includes accelerated sanctions, support for opposition movements, and efforts to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. But the memo also acknowledges that these tools are less effective than in previous decades. Sanctions have not collapsed the Venezuelan government. Opposition movements lack popular legitimacy, and diplomatic isolation means little when China, Russia, India, and much of the developing world continue normal relations. The memo concludes with a recommendation to prioritize lithium extraction in allied countries, including Canada and Australia, and to invest heavily in lithium recycling and alternative battery technologies. In other words, the IMF is advising a retreat. They recognize that the era of easy Western access to developing world resources is ending. At this point, I need to step back from emotion and look at this through a realist lens. In international relations, states act according to their interests, not ideals. Power, security, and survival drive decisions. When a great power declines, secondary powers seek to maximize their autonomy and align with rising powers. This is not ideology. This is rational strategic behavior. Venezuela assessed its position. It holds a critical resource. It faces a hostile hegemon in the United States. It has potential partners in China and Russia who offer capital, technology, and political support without demanding regime change. The rational choice, from a realist perspective, is to nationalize the resource, align with the rising powers, and bet that the declining hegemon lacks the will or capability to enforce its preferences through military intervention. This calculation becomes even more rational when we consider that the United States is overstretched militarily, distracted by multiple global commitments, and increasingly reluctant to engage in direct interventions. Venezuela is not Iraq or Libya. It has mountainous terrain, a loyal military, and powerful allies. The cost of intervention would be enormous, and the likelihood of success is uncertain. The United States knows this. Venezuela knows that. The United States knows this. Therefore, the threat of intervention is not credible. Without that threat, economic sanctions lose much of their coercive power, especially when alternative partners exist. This is where the story gets really interesting. The realist framework also explains why other Latin American nations are likely to follow Venezuela's lead. Argentina nationalized its oil industry under President Fernandez in 2023. Bolivia has maintained state control over lithium since 2021. Mexico is gradually reasserting control over its energy sector despite NAFTA obligations. Chile, long considered the most market-friendly economy in the region, is debating constitutional changes that would give the state greater control over natural resources. This is not a sudden ideological shift to the left. This is a rational response to structural changes in the global system. When the dominant power can no longer credibly threaten punishment, and when an alternative patron offers better terms, states realign. The rules-based international order, which in practice meant rules written by Washington and enforced through economic and military pressure, is breaking down. Not because of ideology, but because the distribution of power has changed. The United States can no longer enforce those rules without bearing costs it is unwilling to pay. Rising powers like China can offer alternatives, and middle powers like Venezuela can exploit that competition to maximize their autonomy. This is textbook realist analysis. The system is shifting from unipolarity to multipolarity, and we are watching that transition happen in real time through commodity politics. This isn't just about Venezuela. The consequences will affect every major economy and every person who uses electronics, drives a vehicle, or relies on the electrical grid. For the United States and Europe, lithium prices will remain elevated, possibly for years. That means electric vehicle adoption slows. It means grid storage projects become less economically viable. It means the energy transition timeline extends, which creates political problems for governments that have committed to aggressive climate targets. For China, this is a strategic victory that consolidates its dominance in the battery supply chain and electric vehicle manufacturing. Chinese companies will continue to undercut Western competitors on price while maintaining quality through vertical integration of supply chains. For Latin America, Venezuela's nationalization provides a model and political cover for other countries to assert greater control over their resources. We are likely to see a wave of nationalizations or renegotiations of mining contracts over the next 5 years. For the global financial system, this represents a challenge to the post-World War II order, where the IMF and World Bank set the terms for developing world resource access. If countries can develop their resources through partnerships with China and other non-Western powers, the relevance of these institutions declines sharply. In personal terms, this means that prices for electronics and electric vehicles will likely increase or remain higher than projected. If you are planning to purchase an electric vehicle, expect prices to stay elevated through at least 2027. If you work in the renewable energy sector, expect supply chain disruptions and cost overruns for battery storage projects. If you are an investor in Western lithium mining companies, understand that their projected growth depended on access to Latin American reserves that are now increasingly unavailable. Recalibrate expectations accordingly. For the entire region of Latin America, this move by Venezuela could accelerate a broader trend toward resource nationalism and South-South cooperation. Countries that have felt exploited by terms of trade and investment frameworks imposed by the West now see an alternative path. They see Venezuela defying the United States, partnering with China, and surviving. That demonstration effect is powerful. Expect to see governments across the region testing the boundaries of what they can do without facing overwhelming retaliation. The international financial system faces a long-term restructuring. The dollar's role as the primary reserve currency depends partly on the denominated pricing of key commodities, especially oil and increasingly lithium. If lithium trades increasingly in yuan or through barter arrangements between state entities, the dollar loses another pillar of its dominance. This is a slow process, not a sudden collapse, but the direction is clear. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will see parallel financial systems emerge, one centered on the dollar, the IMF, and Western capital markets, another centered on the yuan, BRICS financial institutions, and bilateral trade agreements. Countries will navigate between these systems based on their interests. Venezuela has made its choice. Others will follow. What we're witnessing is not simply a dispute over mining rights, but a fundamental challenge to the governance structures that have defined the global economy for 75 years. Venezuela has demonstrated that middle powers with critical resources can reject Western financial frameworks, partner with rising powers, and still develop economically. This breaks the monopoly that institutions like the IMF held over development financing. It proves that the Washington consensus, which insisted that privatization and openness to foreign capital were prerequisites for growth, is not the only path. When powerful states compete for influence, smaller states gain leverage. Venezuela is using that leverage brilliantly. The IMF's internal memo inadvertently confirms this. Their panic reveals that they understand the systemic implications. If the model of Western-led privatization collapses in Venezuela and succeeds through state-led development with Chinese partnership, the entire ideological foundation of neoliberal globalization is called into question. This is why the response has been so intense. This is why the stakes are so high. As realist analysis would predict, when hegemons decline and cannot enforce their preferred order, the system becomes more competitive, more multipolar, and more unpredictable. States pursue their interests more aggressively because the costs of defiance decrease. This move by Venezuela marks another step in that transition. It demonstrates that resource-rich nations are no longer willing to accept terms dictated by Washington and its allied institutions. They have alternatives now. They have partners who offer capital, technology, and markets without demanding political concessions. The unipolar world is fragmenting, and Venezuela is positioning itself strategically in this new multipolar reality. The hidden reason behind this nationalization is not socialist ideology or anti-American sentiment, though those elements exist. The hidden reason is cold strategic calculation. Venezuela assessed the global balance of power, identified its leverage, secured alternative partnerships, and acted to maximize its long-term autonomy and resource control. This is rational state behavior in a changing international system. This is realism in action.